I felt the mountain shudder beneath my feet. Not an earthquake, not wind, something deeper, something that had been sleeping under stone for longer than stone had names. The priests were already running down from the temple, their white robes trailing dust and ash. One of them grabbed my arm, his fingers cold, his eyes wide with something I had never seen in a priest before. Fear. Real fear. He said nothing. There were no words for what was happening. We both turned towards the valley. The air was wrong. Too still. Too heavy. Like the sky itself was holding its breath. Then I heard it. A sound so low, it wasn't really a sound at all. More like a vibration that came up through the earth and into my bones. The olive trees began to sway even though there was no wind. The stone altar behind us groaned. Cracks appeared in the marble steps, thin black lines spreading like veins. The priest let go of my arm and fell to his knees. I wanted to run. Every part of me screamed to run, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, watching the horizon, waiting for something I didn't understand. That's when the sky split. Not with lightning, not with clouds. It split like old cloth, like the world itself was tearing open. And through that tear, I saw something vast, something older than the gods we prayed to, older than the temples we built, older than memory. I saw the shape of what came before. The priests had told us stories. Everyone knew the stories. The Titans, the old ones, the first children of earth and sky who ruled when the world was young and wild, and nothing had been decided yet. But those were just stories. Myths to explain the mountains and the sea, and why thunder sounded like anger. This was not a story. This was real. The mountain shook again, harder this time. I fell, my hands hit stone, and I felt the vibration travel through my palms, up my arms, into my chest. It felt like a heartbeat, slow, massive, ancient. When I looked up, the tear in the sky was wider, and I understood something terrible. The old world was waking up, not returning, not invading. It had never really left. It had just been sleeping, buried, forgotten, covered over by newer gods and newer stories and newer names for things that had no names before. But it was still there, underneath, always underneath. The priest was chanting now, old words I didn't recognize, words from before our language, maybe from before any language. His voice was shaking. The mountain was shaking. Everything was shaking. I tried to stand, but the ground wouldn't stay still. That's when I saw them. Shapes moving in the valley. Huge, slow, like mountains learning to walk. They weren't coming from anywhere. They were just becoming visible, as if they had always been there, and we had simply stopped being able to see them. The Titans, not as statues, not as stories, as themselves. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to pray, but I didn't know who to pray to anymore. The gods we worshipped, the gods of the city and the temple and the harvest. They suddenly felt small, young, like children playing at being eternal. These things in the valley, these vast, slow-moving shapes that were half stone and the half storm, and half something else entirely. They were what came before children, before play, before anything gentle or kind or human. They were the first law, the first order, and they were remembering how to move. The priest grabbed my shoulder and pulled me toward the temple. We ran. Others were running too, villagers and farmers and merchants, all of us scrambling up the stone steps like ants fleeing a flood. Inside the temple, it was dark and cool, and the air smelled like incense and old prayers. We huddled together in the shadows while outside the world came undone. I pressed my back against a pillar and tried to breathe, tried to think, tried to understand what I had just seen. But there was no understanding it. Not really. Some things are too old to understand. Too big, too fundamental. They exist before understanding was even possible, before language could wrap itself around experience and make it small enough to hold. The Titans were like that. They weren't characters in a story. They were the conditions that made stories possible. The frame, the foundation, the deep structure underneath everything we thought was real. And now, that structure was shifting. Hours passed, maybe days. Time felt strange inside the temple, like it was moving at different speeds in different corners, like the building existed in multiple moments at once. Some of the priests were still chanting. Others had gone silent, staring at nothing, their minds somewhere else entirely. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, I wasn't in the temple anymore. I was standing on a shore I didn't recognize. The sea in front of me was the wrong color, darker than any sea should be, and it moved in ways that didn't match the wind. Behind me was a mountain range that hurt to look at, peaks that bent in directions that shouldn't exist. This wasn't my world. This was the world before. Somehow, through the shaking and the tearing and the waking, I had slipped backward. Not in time exactly. Time didn't work like that here. I had slipped underneath time, into the place where the old order still held. The world before the Olympians was not a world at all. Not as we understand worlds. It was something rawer, more essential, less finished. Imagine the difference between a thought and a word. A thought is fluid, shapeless, containing contradictions and possibilities. A word is fixed, defined, limited by the need to mean one thing clearly. The world under the Titans was thought. The world under Zeus became word. In the beginning, there was only chaos, not disorder, not randomness. Chaos in the older sense, the vast empty space that exists before anything can be distinguished from anything else. A potential, a gap, an opening where something might eventually happen, but hasn't happened yet. And from this chaos came the first divisions. Gaia, the earth. Not the earth we walk on, the dirt and stone and rivers. Gaia was the principle of solidity, of having substance, of being a place where things could stand. She was foundation, ground, the basic fact of there-ness. And with her came Uranos, the sky. Not the blue dome we see when we look up. Uranos was the principle of above, of distance, of everything that is not ground. He was height and space and the unreachable. And from their union, their constant dance of above and below, came everything else. The Titans were born, 12 of them, though some stories say more, some say less. Numbers were different then. Naming was different. They were not individuals in the way we think of individuals. They were forces, aspects, fundamental operating principles of how existence worked. Oceanus, the great river that circled the world, the boundary between the known and the unknown. Not just water, but the concept of flow, of circulation, of things moving in eternal patterns. Hyperion, the light that came before the sun, the raw illumination that made seeing possible. Not warm, not gentle, just bright, pure visibility. Themis, the natural law, the way things ought to be without anyone deciding or enforcing. The order that emerges from the structure of reality itself. Mnemosyne, memory, the force that allows the past to touch the present, that makes continuity possible. Without her, there would only be disconnected moments, each one complete and alone. Chronos, time, but not time as we experience it, measured in hours and days and years. Chronos was the principle of sequence, of before and after, of things happening in an order that couldn't be reversed. He was the fact that you cannot step in the same river twice. He was change itself, slow and grinding and inevitable. These were the Titans, and the world they made was nothing like the world we know. There were no seasons then, not as distinct periods of cold and warmth and rebirth. Time moved differently under Chronos. It stretched and compressed, according to principles we can't access anymore. A day might last a lifetime. A year might pass in a heartbeat. Duration was not fixed. The sky was closer to the earth. Uranus lay upon Gaia constantly, an eternal embrace that left no room for anything to grow between them. The first children were pressed into the earth, trapped in the dark spaces underneath the surface, unable to emerge, unable to breathe. This was not cruelty. Not yet. Cruelty requires intention, awareness of suffering, a choice to cause pain. This was just the natural state of things when sky and earth had not yet learned to separate. But Gaia felt her children struggling in the darkness beneath her skin. She felt them pushing against stone, trying to find space, trying to become something more than potential. And she knew that the old order, the first arrangement of sky and earth and time and light, was not enough. It was too simple, too compressed. There was no room for complexity, for variation, for the kind of existence that could surprise itself. Something had to change. She went to Chronos, the youngest and cleverest of her children, and she gave him a weapon. A sickle made from the hardest substance in existence, the concentrated essence of separation, of cutting, of making two things from one. She told him what needed to be done. Chronos waited until his father came down from the heights, came to lie with Gaia as he always did, mindless and vast and eternal. And when Uranus was vulnerable, when he was close enough to reach, Chronos struck. The sickle cut through divine flesh. Uranus screamed, not with voice, with the whole structure of the sky. The sound was so fundamental that it became encoded in the shape of mountains, in the patterns of coastlines, in the deep trenches of the ocean. You can still hear it if you know how to listen. A low, sustained note that runs underneath everything. Sky and earth separated. Not completely. They never would be completely apart, but enough that a space opened between them. Enough that the children trapped underneath could finally emerge, blinking into the half-light of the new world. This was the first violence, the first act that changed the fundamental structure of reality through force, rather than natural process. Before this, things happened because they had to happen, because that was their nature. After this, things could happen because someone chose to make them happen. The age of the Titans had truly begun. Chronos took his father's place, not through inheritance, but through action. He became the ruler of the cosmos, the one who determined how time would flow, how the seasons would turn, how the world would age and change and transform. And for a long age, longer than we can imagine because our imaginations are shaped by the world that came after, the Titans governed existence. It was not a gentle age. It was not cruel either. It was something outside those categories entirely. The Titans did not think in terms of kindness or malice. They thought in terms of function, pattern, necessity. They were the world's first operating system, the rules that made everything else possible. Under their reign, the earth was wilder, stranger, more alive in ways that would terrify us now. Mountains moved, not quickly, but they moved, migrating across the landscape according to rhythms only they understood. The sea was not one thing, but many, different bodies of water with different properties, different colors, different laws of motion. Some parts of the ocean flowed upward. Some parts were solid as stone. Some parts existed in more than 3 dimensions, extending into directions that don't have names anymore. Animals were different too, larger, more varied, less fixed in their forms. A creature might be one thing in the morning and another thing by evening, depending on what the moment required, depending on what aspect of itself it needed to express. Species weren't categories yet. They were more like neighborhoods, places where similar patterns tended to gather without any firm boundaries. And humans, the first humans, if you could even call them that, were barely separate from the landscape they lived in. They were part of the earth in a literal sense, growing from the soil like plants, like outcroppings of conscious stone. They didn't build shelters because they didn't need to. The earth would simply open and provide hollows, caves, spaces shaped perfectly for rest. They didn't hunt because animals would offer themselves when food was needed, understanding their role in the great circulation of matter and energy. Memory worked differently then, not stored in individual minds, but distributed across the whole world. A tree might remember something that happened to a river. A stone might carry the memory of a storm. Nothing was truly lost because everything was connected, part of one vast living system that held all information in its structure. This was the golden age that later poets would romanticize, the time of peace and plenty when no one had to work and the earth gave freely, and death was just a transformation into another form. But that romanticism misses something essential. The golden age was golden because nothing had tarnished yet, not because it was perfect or ideal or good. It was golden because it was first, original, uncorrupted by complexity. And that was exactly the problem. The old order was too simple, too stable, too predictable. It couldn't evolve, couldn't surprise itself, couldn't create anything genuinely new because everything that could happen was already implicit in the original structure. The world under the Titans was like a perfect crystal, beautiful and complete and utterly unable to grow. Something had to break, and it did. Kronos, who had overthrown his own father, who had learned the power of violence and change and choice, became afraid that his children would do to him what he had done to Aranos, afraid that the cycle of overthrow would continue, that each generation would rise against the previous one, that stability was impossible, that power could never be held. So he tried to stop time. Not metaphorically, literally. Kronos was time itself, the principle of sequence and change. And he attempted to halt his own nature, to freeze the cosmic order in place, to prevent the next generation from emerging and challenging his rule. He swallowed his children as they were born, not killed them, not destroyed them, swallowed them, took them back into himself, into the undifferentiated timelessness that existed before sequence began. He tried to make it so the future never arrived, so that the present would extend forever, unchanging and eternal. But you cannot stop time by being time. You cannot freeze change by changing. The contradiction was built into the attempt itself. His wife, Rhea, understood this. She saved the youngest child, Zeus, by hiding him in a cave on Crete and giving Kronos a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes to swallow instead. And Zeus grew up outside his father's influence, outside the old order, learning different ways of being, preparing to challenge everything the Titans had built. When he was strong enough, he returned. He freed his siblings from their father's belly. He gathered allies, younger gods and goddesses who had never known the world under Titan rule, who imagined different possibilities, different structures, different ways existence could be organized. And then began the war that would remake reality, the Titanomachy. They called it a war. 10 years of fighting, they said. Zeus and his siblings and allies against Kronos and the older Titans. Battles that shook the cosmos. Lightning bolts hurled from mountaintops. Earthquakes that split continents. Tsunamis that rewrote coastlines. But it wasn't really a war. Wars are fought between parties who share the same basic understanding of reality, but disagree about who should control it. The Titanomachy was something deeper. It was a conflict between two completely different versions of how existence should work. The Titans fought to preserve the old order, the simple, stable system where everything had its place and function, and nothing could surprise the structure that contained it. They fought with the weight of precedent, with the authority of being first, with the sheer inertia of established pattern. Zeus and the Olympians fought for something that didn't exist yet. They fought for complexity, for possibility, for a world that could change and grow and become something other than what it had always been. They fought with innovation, with new tactics, with strategies the old order couldn't predict because it had never imagined them. It was the fight between crystal and chaos, between perfection and evolution, between the eternal and the emergent. And it literally broke the world, not destroyed it, broke it, shattered the old unity into fragments, into distinct domains that could develop separately, into a multiplicity where before there had only been singular vastness. The sky separated further from the earth, rising higher, becoming truly unreachable. The ocean pulled away from the land, establishing firm boundaries, becoming its own realm with its own rules. The underworld opened beneath the surface, not as a place of punishment yet, but simply as another layer, another dimension, another way of existing that hadn't been possible before. Time itself fractured. Under Kronos, time had been one vast, slow grinding wheel, everything eventually returning to where it started, no real progress possible. Under Zeus, time became arrow-like, linear, directional. The past became distinct from the present. The future became unknown. Possibility entered the world in a way it never had before. This was the great wound, the great breaking, the moment when the simple organic unity of the Titans gave way to the complex differentiated structure of the Olympians. And it hurt. Reality itself was in pain as the old patterns were torn apart, as new structures were forced into being, as the world learned to exist in ways it had never existed before. Mountains that had stood for eons crumbled. Seas that had flowed in eternal patterns dried up or changed course. The weather became unstable, no longer following predictable rhythms, but responding to the whims and conflicts of individual gods. The Titans fought with everything they had. Oceanus sent walls of water that could drown continents. Hyperion unleashed light so bright it burned away vision itself. Atlas held up the sky even as it tried to fall and crush the earth. Prometheus saw the future and tried to guide his fellow Titans towards strategies that might win. But they were fighting against inevitability. Not because Zeus was stronger, though he was strong. Not because the Olympians were more numerous, though they had gathered many allies. They were fighting against the fact that the old order had become unstable, that it contained contradictions it couldn't resolve, that it had reached the limit of what simplicity could accomplish. The world wanted to become more complex. Reality itself was on the side of change. One by one, the Titans fell, not killed. You cannot kill what is fundamental. You cannot destroy the principles that make existence possible. But they could be defeated, bound, removed from active participation in shaping the world. Zeus cast thunderbolts made from concentrated change, from pure possibility, from the essence of becoming. Where they struck, things could no longer remain as they were. The Titans, who represented eternal, unchanging patterns, could not withstand this. They froze, they crumbled, they fell. Kronos himself was the last to fall. The battle between Zeus and his father was not fought with weapons or strength. It was fought with time itself. Kronos tried to slow everything down, to trap Zeus in an eternal moment that would never progress to the next one. Zeus countered by accelerating, by moving so fast through time that he existed in multiple moments simultaneously, impossible to pin down, impossible to contain. And in the end, Zeus forced his father to experience what Kronos had always feared most: succession, the passage from present to past, the moment of being replaced. Kronos fell, and with him fell the age of Titans. Zeus and the other Olympians took the defeated Titans and cast them down into Tartarus, the deepest part of the underworld, far below even the realm of the dead. A prison made from the absence of change, from eternal stasis, from the kind of timelessness that Kronos had tried to impose on the world, but now experienced as punishment. There they would remain, bound in chains forged from their own nature, unable to rise, unable to affect the world above, unable to do anything but remember what they had been when they were everything. Some of the Titans were spared, those who had sided with Zeus, or who had remained neutral, or who performed functions too essential to suspend. Oceanus still surrounded the world, but now as a boundary rather than a living presence. Prometheus was kept in the world above, though he too would eventually be punished for different reasons. Themis remained, but her natural law was now subordinate to Zeus's decrees. The world was remade. Zeus claimed the sky, the realm of weather and prophecy and sovereign power. Poseidon took the sea, now a separate kingdom with different rules and different creatures. Hades accepted the underworld, the realm of the dead who now truly died instead of merely transforming. The earth was divided among various gods and goddesses, each with their own domain, their own areas of influence, their own stories to tell. And humans, the new humans, emerged into this changed world. They were different from what came before, more individual, more separate from the landscape, more capable of making choices, but also more vulnerable to consequences. They had to build their own shelters now, find their own food, remember their own histories in their own limited minds. They aged, they suffered, they died in ways that felt final, but they also had something the first humans never had: stories, individual narratives, the possibility of being a character in the world's unfolding rather than just a feature of an eternal landscape. This was the gift and the curse of the Olympian age. More freedom, more possibility, more pain. The world under Zeus was more interesting than the world under the Titans, more dramatic, more surprising, but it was also more uncertain, more dangerous, more likely to hurt you. And deep down, in the foundations, in the bedrock underneath the surface story, the old order remained, sleeping, bound, silent, but not gone, never gone. What was lost when the Titans fell? Everything and nothing. The world continued. The sun still rose, rain still fell, mountains still stood against the sky. But the quality of existence changed. Under the Titans, the world was meaning. Every stone, every stream, every animal, every storm was part of a vast interconnected pattern that made sense as a totality, even if individual moments seemed random or cruel. There was no distinction between what happened and what it meant. Events were their own interpretation. Under the Olympians, the world became symbol. Things no longer meant themselves. They pointed beyond themselves to stories, to divine will, to cosmic politics. A storm wasn't just weather. It was Zeus's anger. A harvest wasn't just growth. It was Demeter's blessing or curse. Everything became a message, a sign, something that needed to be read and understood. This was the birth of religion as we know it. Under the Titans, there was no need for temples or priests or sacrifices because the divine was identical with the natural. You couldn't worship the earth because you were the earth, made from it, returning to it, never separate enough to establish a relationship of devotion. Under the Olympians, worship became necessary. The gods were distinct from the world, ruling it from above, demanding acknowledgement, requiring propitiation. Humans built temples to house statues of beings who no longer walked among them. They made offerings to attract divine favor. They told stories to remember how these new gods wanted to be approached. The poets remember this as a fall, a descent from a golden age of ease and plenty into a silver age of work and suffering. And there's truth in that. Life became harder, more uncertain. The earth no longer gave freely. Weather became unpredictable. Animals hid instead of offering themselves. But there's another way to see it. The fall was also a liberation. Under the Titans, everything was necessary. Nothing could be otherwise. The world was perfect in its way, but it was the perfection of a prison, beautiful and complete, and offering no possibility of escape or transformation. Under the Olympians, things could fail, plans could go wrong, prayers could go unanswered. But that meant success was possible too. Achievement, triumph, the joy of making something work that might not have worked. Humans became heroes, not because they were powerful, but because they could choose to attempt the impossible and sometimes, occasionally, succeed. Odysseus could outwit the Cyclops, Perseus could slay Medusa, Theseus could navigate the labyrinth. These stories had no equivalent in the age of Titans, when everything was what it was and nothing could be changed through cleverness or courage or determination. So the loss was real, but it wasn't simple. What was lost was certainty, stability, the deep bone knowledge that you were part of something vast and eternal that would continue regardless of what you did or didn't do. What was gained was significance, the possibility that your individual life, your specific choices, your particular struggles might actually matter, might change something, might leave a mark that wouldn't immediately be absorbed back into the great pattern. But the old world didn't vanish completely. It couldn't. The Titans were foundations, not buildings. You can build a new structure on top of a foundation, but the foundation remains, supporting everything above it, whether you acknowledge it or not. And sometimes, in certain places, at certain moments, the foundation shows through. There are places in the world where the old order is still visible if you know how to look. Not places on maps, not tourist destinations, places in a different sense, thin spots where the Olympian overlay doesn't quite cover the Titan substrate, deep caves that open into darkness more profound than the absence of light, mountain peaks where the air feels older than breath, ocean trenches where the water moves according to patterns that modern science can't quite explain, ruins so ancient that even the Greeks who built the Parthenon considered them impossibly old. In these places, time feels different, thicker, slower, as if Kronos' influence still lingers, as if the measured linear time of Zeus hasn't fully penetrated, as if you've slipped sideways into a pocket where the old rules still apply. Sailors know this, real sailors, not tourists or weekend fishermen, but people who spend months at sea, who learn to read water and wind and the subtle signs that most landlocked minds can't process. They talk about it carefully, in language that sounds like superstition, but isn't quite. They speak of places where the compass doesn't work right, where the stars seem misaligned, where you can feel the presence of something vast beneath the hull, something that was there before boats were invented, before the concept of navigation existed. Shepherds know it too. Those who tend flocks in truly remote mountains, far from roads and villages and the structures of civilization. They tell stories of valleys that appear on no maps, of passes that open only at certain times, of stones that hum with frequencies that make your bones ache. They don't talk about it much to outsiders. What would be the point? But among themselves, in the high meadows where the air is thin and ancient, they remember. And there are humans, rare humans, who seem to carry the old world in their very bodies, seers, oracles, madmen and mystics who speak in languages that predate language, who see connections invisible to normal perception, who remember things that haven't happened yet or happened so long ago that history has no record of them. The Greeks had a word for this kind of knowledge, menos, divine madness. But it wasn't madness in the sense of broken thinking. It was sanity from a different frame of reference, clarity according to older rules, the ability to perceive what the Titan world looked like without the filter of Olympian interpretation. The oracle at Delphi breathed vapors that rose from a chasm in the earth, from deep underground where the old order still pooled in concentrated form. When she spoke, priestesses translated her words into prophecies that kings and heroes tried to interpret. But the original utterance, before translation, before interpretation, was in the language of the Titans. Pure pattern, pure relationship, meaning without symbols. Most people couldn't bear it, can't bear it. The Titan perspective is too vast, too impersonal, too indifferent to the individual stories that make human life meaningful. To see the world as the Titans saw it would mean losing yourself entirely, dissolving into the great pattern, becoming once again a feature of the landscape rather than a character in a narrative. But the capacity remains, dormant in most of us, but present. The ability to perceive the older layer, to sense the foundation beneath the structure, to remember that the world we navigate Every day is built on top of something stranger and deeper and more ancient than our stories can contain. And sometimes, very rarely, the old world pushes back. Earthquakes are the most obvious example. The Earth literally breaking through the surface order, shattering the structures humans have built, reminding us that geology precedes architecture, that stone is older than civilization, that the ground beneath our feet is not a passive stage, but an active force with its own nature and rhythms. The Greeks understood this. They knew that Poseidon was called the Earth Shaker, not just because he ruled the sea, but because he retained some connection to the primordial powers that came before the Olympians. They knew that when the ground shook, it wasn't just natural disaster, it was memory, the old order asserting itself, the Titans speaking through the medium of pure physical force, volcanic eruptions too, mountains opening to reveal what's beneath, fire and stone and gases from the deep, interior, where the old rules still apply, where matter exists in forms and temperatures that the surface world can't sustain. The Greeks told stories about titans being imprisoned under volcanoes, about their struggles causing eruptions. And maybe that's not entirely wrong if you translate it properly. Maybe the volcanic activity is what happens when the foundation shifts, when the layer we don't normally see becomes briefly, violently visible. But there are subtler intrusions too. Dreams that don't feel like your own thoughts, but like you've tapped into something older, vaster, more impersonal. Not messages from gods, but glimpses of the pattern itself, the deep structure that generates both gods and humans and everything else. Moments of synchronicity where the world seems to organize itself according to principles that have nothing to do with causation, where meaning precedes event, where things happen because they fit a pattern rather than because something caused them. Feelings of déjà vu so strong they make you dizzy, as if you're remembering something that hasn't happened yet, or that happened in a different version of reality, or that's always happening underneath the surface of linear time. These are small things, easy to dismiss, easy to explain away as coincidence or psychology or the brain's pattern recognition systems misfiring. But what if they're not misfiring? What if they're working correctly, perceiving accurately, picking up on the reality of the Titan layer that still exists beneath the Olympian overlay? What if the old world is still there, and we're the ones who've changed, who've learned to filter it out, who've trained ourselves to see only the surface story and ignore the foundation? The philosophers understood this, or some of them did. Heraclitus, the dark one, the obscure one, who said you can't step in the same river twice. He was trying to describe the Titan world, the world of pure flux and transformation that existed before things were frozen into stable categories. He knew that the apparent solidity of objects was an illusion, that everything was fire and flow and change, that the Olympian order of fixed forms and stable identities was a useful fiction, but not the deepest truth. Parmenides argued the opposite, that change itself was the illusion, that being was eternal and unchanging, that multiplicity was appearance and unity was reality. He was describing the Titan world from a different angle, the eternal, unchanging substrate that persists regardless of surface transformations. They were both right, or both wrong, or both describing the same thing from different perspectives, the way you might describe a mountain differently if you approach from the north or the south, even though it's the same mountain. The Titan world is both eternal change and unchanging eternity, pure flow and absolute stability. It's both because it exists before the distinction between those concepts was established, before you had to choose one or the other, before the law of non-contradiction became a law. And that's why it's so hard to talk about. Every word we have, every concept we use, every distinction we make is built on the Olympian framework. Subject and object, cause and effect, before and after, inside and outside. All of these are categories that emerged when the world was remade, when complexity triumphed over simplicity, when the crystal broke into fragments. To describe the Titan world, you'd need a language that came before language, thoughts that came before thinking, a way of knowing that didn't separate knower from known. But we can't do that. Not anymore. Not fully. We're creatures of the Olympian age, shaped by its structures, dependent on its categories, unable to perceive what came before except through the distorting lens of what came after. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe we couldn't survive direct exposure to the Titan world, to that level of unity and intensity and impersonality. Maybe we need the distance, the mediation, the protective filter of the Olympian overlay. Maybe that's what civilization is, a necessary forgetting, a deliberate blindness, a choice to see the world in simpler, smaller, more manageable terms, even though we know somewhere deep in our inherited memories that the reality is vaster and stranger than our stories can contain. But the knowledge remains, encoded in myths that we tell as if they're just entertainment, preserved in rituals that we perform without remembering their meaning, hidden in the structures of language itself, in the etymologies of words, in the patterns of grammar that shape how we think, before we've consciously thought anything. The Titans are still there. They were never truly defeated. They can't be. You can't defeat the foundations of existence. You can only build on top of them, cover them over, pretend they're not there. But they are, always underneath, always supporting, always waiting. And sometimes, in the deep quiet of the night, when the surface narratives fall away and you're left alone with the bare fact of being here, of existing at all, you can feel them. The old order, the first law, the way things were before they became things, before there were names for them, before anyone was there to name them. It's still there. It's always been there. And it always will be. I opened my eyes, and I was back in the temple. The shaking had stopped. The priests were no longer chanting. Outside, the sun was rising or setting. I couldn't tell which. Time had become uncertain during whatever had just happened. The priest who had grabbed my arm earlier was sitting against a pillar, staring at his hands. He looked older. We all looked older, as if we'd aged years in a few hours, as if we'd been somewhere that measured duration differently. I stood up, slowly. My legs were shaky, but they held. I walked to the entrance and looked out at the valley. The shapes were gone. The vast, slow-moving presences I had seen, or thought I had seen, were no longer visible. The sky was whole again. The mountain stood as it always had, solid and silent and old. But something was different. The air, maybe, or the light, or the quality of the silence. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something, preparing for a change that hadn't quite arrived yet, but was inevitable. I realized that what I had witnessed, what we had all witnessed, was not an invasion or an attack or an awakening. It was a reminder, a brief, thin moment when the old layer became visible, when the foundation showed through the structure built on top of it. The Titans hadn't returned. They had never left. They had just become invisible, covered over by newer gods and newer stories and the accumulated weight of centuries of human forgetting. But they were still there, underneath, always underneath, supporting everything, making everything possible, waiting with the patience of mountains, the patience of time itself, the patience of things that were before patience was invented. And I understood then that this would happen again. Maybe not in my lifetime, maybe not for generations, but the old order would show through again, would push up from below, would remind us that the world we think we know is just the surface of something deeper. Because foundations don't go away. You can build on them, you can forget about them, but they remain, solid, eternal, indifferent to what you construct above. The Titans were the foundation of the world, and the world still stands on them, even now, even after everything that's changed, even in this age of Zeus and the Olympians and all the gods who came after. The old order persists, not as a threat, not as something to fear or fight or flee from, just as the basic truth of what exists beneath existence, the pattern that makes patterns possible, the first law that allows all other laws. And knowing this, strange as it sounds, was comforting, because it meant that no matter how chaotic the surface became, no matter how uncertain the stories or how unstable the structures humans built, there was something beneath it all that was solid, ancient, reliable in a way that had nothing to do with kindness or care, but everything to do with simply being there, being real, being the ground on which even gods had to stand. I walked down the temple steps and back toward the village. Other people were emerging from their shelters, blinking in the light, checking to see if the world was still intact. It was, more or less. A few buildings had crumbled, a few trees had fallen, but nothing catastrophic, nothing that couldn't be repaired. Life would continue. The surface story would resume. We would go back to our daily rhythms, our small concerns, our individual narratives. But we would remember, in the deep, quiet places inside ourselves, in the dreams that made no sense, in the moments when time felt strange and the world seemed briefly unfamiliar, we would remember that there was another layer beneath this one, the Titan world, the old order, the way things were before they became the way things are, still there, still supporting us, still holding everything in its vast impersonal embrace. And maybe that's all we needed to know, that the foundation was solid even if we couldn't see it, that the old gods were still there even if they no longer spoke, that the world was deeper and stranger and more ancient than any story could contain. That was enough, more than enough. I walked home under a sky that was just a sky, through streets that were just streets, past people who were just people, and it was beautiful, not because it was simple or safe or completely understood, but because beneath it all, holding it all up, invisible but indestructible, was something older than beauty, older than meaning, older than thought itself. The Titans, the first children of earth and sky, the foundations of everything, still there, still sleeping, still dreaming the world into being with every slow eternal breath. And in that knowledge, in that deep bone certainty that the ground beneath our feet was real and ancient and would endure long after we were gone, there was a strange kind of peace. Not comfort exactly, but something better, something true. The world was old. The world was vast. The world was built on foundations we could barely imagine and didn't need to understand. We could live on the surface, tell our stories, build our temples, worship our gods, and that was fine. That was enough. Because underneath, where we couldn't see but could sometimes feel, the old order was still there, patient, eternal, waiting with the calm certainty of things that know they will outlast every name we give them, every story we tell about them, every attempt to contain them in words or images or thoughts. The Titans were still there, and the world still rested on them. And that was exactly as it should be. The sun set, the stars emerged, the night deepened, and in that darkness, older than any light we could kindle, the ancient world continued its slow, eternal turning, grinding out the patterns that made existence possible, holding everything in place without effort or will or concern, just being, just existing, just continuing as they always had and always would, forever underneath, forever supporting, forever silent. The lost order of the world wasn't lost at all. It was just sleeping, dreaming, waiting. And that was fine. That was enough. That was exactly how it needed to be. I closed my eyes and let the darkness take me, trusting the old foundations to hold, knowing they would, feeling grateful for their silent, eternal strength. The world was old. The world was deep. The world was built on things we would never fully understand, but could trust completely. And in that trust, in that surrender to the ancient patterns that made everything possible, there was peace, real peace, deep peace, the kind of peace that comes from knowing you don't have to hold everything up yourself because something older and stronger already is, has been, will always be. The Titans, the old ones, the foundations, still there, still strong, still dreaming the world. And we were safe in that dream, held in those vast, impersonal hands, cradled by forces that would outlast stars and stones and everything we could name. Safe, held, home, in the deep dark beneath the stories, where the old order still ruled, where nothing ever really changed because nothing ever needed to, where time moved differently and the world was what it had always been and always would be. There, in that place, in that eternal now, in that foundation beneath all foundations. The Titans waited and held us and continued their slow, eternal work of being the ground on which everything else stood. And that was enough, more than enough, everything we needed. The world was old, and we were young, and the old would outlast the young. And that was exactly how it should be. Sleep came, deep and dreamless, the sleep of things that know they're held by something stronger than themselves, the sleep of trust, the sleep of surrender, the sleep of coming home to foundations you'd forgotten but never really left. The Titans held the world held us. And in that holding, that eternal embrace of stone and time and silence, there was peace, perfect peace, ancient peace, the peace that passes understanding because it comes from before understanding began. The old order, the lost order, the order that was never really lost because it was never really gone, still there, always there, forever there, underneath everything, supporting everything, dreaming everything into being with every slow, eternal breath. The Titans, the first ones, the foundations. The world remembers in strange ways, not through books or monuments or the careful records humans keep. Those are surface memories, fragile and temporary, easily lost to fire or flood or the simple erosion of time passing. The world remembers deeper than that, in stone, in water, in the recurring patterns that play out across millennia without anyone noticing the repetition. The Titans taught the world how to remember this way. Before them, there was only the eternal present of chaos, everything happening at once, nothing distinct enough from anything else to create the difference that makes memory possible. The Titans created duration, sequence. The basic fact of before and after that allows experience to accumulate, to build into something more than just disconnected moments. Mnemosyne was one of the 12. Memory herself, personified. Not the act of remembering, but the capacity for it. The structure that makes it possible for the past to touch the present without becoming the present. The poets called her the mother of the muses, those 9 daughters who would later inspire human creativity and art. But that came later, after the Olympian victory, after Zeus lay with her for 9 consecutive nights and brought forth beauty from memory. In the Titan age, she was something else, something less gentle, less concerned with inspiration or artistic truth. She was duration itself, the fact that time leaves traces, that what happens shapes what happens next, even if the original event has passed beyond reach. Without her, the world would have been like a wave constantly crashing and reforming, each moment complete in itself, with no connection to what came before. Nothing could learn, nothing could grow, nothing could develop the complexity that comes from accumulated experience. She was the first teacher, though she taught nothing deliberately. Just by existing, she made it possible for patterns to persist, for information to carry forward, for the world to become something more than endless repetition of the same eternal forms. And when the Titans fell, when Zeus and the Olympians reshaped reality according to their vision, they couldn't destroy Mnemosyne. Memory was too fundamental. Without it, even the new gods couldn't establish their rule, couldn't create the stable identities and narratives that made the Olympian age possible. So they transformed her instead, tamed her, made her the mother of beauty rather than the mother of duration, turned her vast impersonal function into something more manageable, more useful, more aligned with the needs of gods who told stories about themselves. But the old function remained, underneath, always underneath. The world still remembers the way Mnemosyne taught it to remember, through repetition and pattern and the slow accumulation of traces that build into something that outlasts any individual moment. Mountains remember through their layers, stone stacked on stone, each stratum a record of conditions that existed when it formed. You can read them if you know how. Trace the history of oceans that rose and fell, climates that warmed and cooled, life forms that emerged and vanished. The mountain doesn't try to remember. It just is what it is. And what it is includes everything that made it. Forests remember through their soil the decomposed matter of countless generations of plants and animals, creating the medium in which new life grows. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is truly lost. Everything that falls becomes part of the foundation for what comes next. Even the sky remembers, in its way, the patterns of wind and weather, shaped by the rotation of the earth and the heat of the sun, and the configuration of land and sea, repeat with variations that contain information about what happened before. Sailors and farmers learned to read these patterns, to predict what was coming based on what had been, because the sky's memory is reliable even if it's not conscious. This is Mnemosyne's gift to the world, this deep structural memory that doesn't require anyone to remember, that persists even when all conscious minds have forgotten. That makes the world cumulative rather than merely cyclical. And humans inherited it, not just the capacity to remember deliberately, to store information in minds and books, and now in computers. That's the Olympian gift, memory as a tool, something you can use strategically. What humans inherited from Mnemosyne is deeper. It's the way your body remembers how to breathe without being taught, the way your heart remembers its rhythm, the way you recognize your mother's face before you have words for mother or face or recognition. Genetic memory, we call it now. Instinct. But those are just newer names for something the Titans understood from the beginning. The past shapes the present, not through conscious recall, but through structure, through the patterns that persist because they've always persisted, because they're woven into the fabric of what exists. And sometimes, rarely, a human touches this deeper layer of memory, not remembering something they personally experienced, but remembering what the species experienced, what the world experienced, what the Titans themselves knew before knowledge became something that required a knowing subject. The oracle at Delphi accessed this. So did the poets in their inspired moments, when the words came from somewhere else, somewhere older, somewhere they couldn't name. So do children sometimes, before they've been fully socialized into the Olympian framework, when they still have one foot in the older world and can see what adults have trained themselves not to see. And so do you, if you're honest, in those moments when you know something without knowing how you know it, when you feel the rightness or wrongness of a situation before you can articulate why, when you respond to patterns you haven't consciously perceived because the response is deeper than consciousness, older than thought. That's Mnemosyne speaking through you, the old memory, the Titan memory, the pattern that knows itself without needing to be known. Time moved differently in the age before Zeus. This is hard to understand from inside linear time, from this world where past and present and future are separate countries with borders between them. But imagine time as a substance rather than a dimension. Thick, heavy, more like honey than like an arrow. Kronos made time this way. He was time, the principle of temporal sequence, but he experienced it so differently from how we experience it that calling it by the same name is almost misleading. For Kronos, every moment contained all moments. Past and future weren't elsewhere. They were layered into the now, compressed and present, accessible without movement. He could see how things would unfold because the unfolding was already there, implicit in the structure of what existed. Causation wasn't a sequence of separate events, but a pattern revealing itself. This is why prophecy was possible in the ancient world. Not because the future was predetermined, but because time under Kronos still retained some of that old thickness, that quality of all moments present at once. The seers and oracles could perceive it, could read the pattern, could see what was already there, even though it hadn't happened yet in the linear sequence. And this is why Kronos feared his own children. He could see the pattern. He could see that Zeus would rise and overthrow him just as he had overthrown Uranos. It wasn't prophecy in the sense of someone telling him. It was direct perception of what time contained. The future wasn't uncertain. It was simply another aspect of the present, visible to eyes that could see past the illusion of sequence. So he tried to prevent it by swallowing his children, taking them back into his own timeless interior where the pattern couldn't unfold. And this reveals something fundamental about the Titan mind. Kronos understood time perfectly, could see all of it at once, knew exactly how the pattern would develop. But he couldn't imagine that the pattern itself could change, that time could become something other than what it was. This was the limitation of the old order. Perfect knowledge within a fixed structure, but no capacity for the structure itself to transform. Zeus brought something new, not better knowledge of time, but a different relationship to it. He couldn't see the future the way Kronos could. He experienced sequence as genuine movement from unknown to known. Each moment was a surprise, a genuine emergence of novelty, rather than just the revelation of what was always already there. This made him weaker in some ways, less certain, more vulnerable to being caught off guard. But it also made him free in a way Kronos could never be. Free to choose, to act against the pattern, to create outcomes that weren't implicit in the initial conditions. When Zeus freed his siblings from Kronos' belly, when he gathered allies and waged war against the Titans, he wasn't fighting against prophecy or destiny. He was fighting to make time itself into something flexible, open-ended, capable of surprise. And he won. Not because he was stronger, though he had strength, not because he had better strategy, though Prometheus and Metis gave him counsel. He won because reality itself was ready for a change, ready to stop being so perfectly knowable, ready to become a place where the future was genuinely open. This was the great transformation. The moment when time stopped being Kronos and became Kronos, stopped being a primordial deity and became just a dimension, a measuring system, something you could mark with calendars and water clocks. Lost something profound in that transformation. The thickness, the richness, the strange layered quality where past and future touch the present, but gained something too. Freedom, possibility, the chance that tomorrow might be genuinely different from today in ways that today can't predict. We live in that transformation still, caught between Kronos' time and Zeus' time, experiencing sequence as something both real and illusory, knowing that the past shapes us completely, while also believing we can choose our futures. And maybe that's exactly right. Maybe we need both kinds of time. The deep, slow Titan time that connects us to ancient patterns and gives our lives weight and meaning, and the bright, fast Olympian time that makes each day feel new and gives us the hope that change is possible. There were 12 Titans, the first generation, though some sources count more or fewer, depending on how you classify the various primordial powers that emerge from chaos alongside them. Oceanus was the eldest, the great river that encircled the world, the boundary between the known and the unknown. Not just water, but the principle of circulation, of things flowing in eternal return. He never joined the war against Zeus. Some say this was wisdom, understanding that the new order was inevitable. Others say it was simply his nature. Oceanus flowed. Flow doesn't fight. It moves around obstacles, finds new paths, continues regardless. Tethys was his sister and wife, goddess of fresh water, of rivers and springs, and the deep aquifers that run beneath the surface. Together, they embodied the water cycle, the endless movement of water from sea to sky, to land and back again. 3,000 daughters they had, the Oceanids, each one a stream or spring or tributary. 3,000 sons, the river gods, all that fresh water in the world, all those currents and flows, children of the oldest Titans. Hyperion was light itself, raw illumination before there was a sun to carry it. He and Theia brought forth Helios the sun, Selene the moon, Eos the dawn. But in the first age, Hyperion's light was different, harsher, more revealing, the kind of light that shows every detail, leaves no shadows, makes hiding impossible. Zeus softened this when he remade the world, gave the light a source, a chariot that could move across the sky, periods of darkness for rest and secrecy. Themis was law, but not law as humans understand it. Not rules imposed from outside, not commands that could be broken. She was natural law, the way things ought to be, because that's how reality is structured. Gravity, causation, the basic patterns that govern existence before any lawgiver appears to name them. She survived the fall of the Titans because Zeus needed her. Even the new order, needed some underlying structure that couldn't be overruled by divine whim. Mnemosyne was memory, as we've discussed. The capacity for the past to inform the present without becoming the present. Phoebe was prophecy, the bright clarity that could see what time contained before time released it into sequence. She gave birth to Leto, who gave birth to Apollo, and through him the oracular tradition continued into the Olympian age. But Apollo's prophecies were different from Phoebe's vision. Mediated, translated, often deliberately obscure. In the Titan age, seeing the future was simple, direct. The pattern was visible to those with eyes to see. Koios was intellect, the faculty of rational thought, of being able to hold ideas and examine them and draw conclusions. He didn't think about specific things. He was thinking itself, the process by which formless knowing becomes articulated understanding. Chronos was time, as we've discussed at length. Time as substance, as pattern, as the basic fact that things happen in sequence, even if all sequence is eternally present. Rhea was flow, the dynamic quality that keeps everything moving, prevents stagnation, ensures that no state of being becomes permanent. She was Kronos' wife, and together they embodied a paradox. Time, which is change, married to flow, which is also change. But time is change with structure, pattern, repetition. Flow is change without pattern, pure transformation. Together they contained the tension between stability and chaos that makes existence possible. Creus was the principle of mastery, of dominance, of power expressing itself through control. He was conquest, authority, the will to shape reality according to intention. Iapetus was mortality, not death exactly, but the quality of existing in time such that beginning and ending are inevitable. He fathered Prometheus, who gave fire to humans. Fire, light and heat that consume their source, that must constantly be fed or they die. The perfect symbol of mortal existence. And there were others, depending on how you count. The Hecatonchires, the 100-handed ones, monsters of overwhelming multiplicity. The Cyclopes, the wheel-eyed ones, who saw with single vision, direct and unmediated. These were often counted separately from the Titans, but they were siblings, children of Gaia and Uranos, part of the first generation. Together, they formed a complete system, not a government or a hierarchy, but an ecology of fundamental principles that made complex existence possible. And this is what was really lost when Zeus overthrew them. Not specific gods, or stories, or even specific powers. What was lost was completeness, the sense that all the essential principles were accounted for, that the world made sense as a totality, that everything fit into a comprehensible pattern. The Olympian age brought freedom and possibility and individual agency, but it also brought fragmentation. The gods became persons with personalities and conflicts and changing moods. They fell in love, grew jealous, took revenge. They were more relatable, more human, easier to worship and pray to, but they were also less reliable. Their laws weren't natural laws that couldn't be broken. They were decrees that could be changed on divine whim. Justice became a matter of which God you'd offended and how much they cared. Fate became negotiable, something you could trick or bargain with if you were clever enough. The world became more interesting, more dramatic, more full of stories, but also more uncertain, less safe, harder to trust that the universe had a structure you could depend on, and humans, who emerged as conscious beings during this transition, inherited this split. Part of us yearns for the Titan certainty, the deep, knowable patterns, the sense that everything fits into a larger order. Part of us loves the Olympian freedom, the possibility of surprise, the chance that we might matter as individuals. We contain both ages. We are the children of the transition, shaped by the conflict between order and chaos, pattern and possibility, certainty and freedom. And maybe this is why the Titan myths persist, why they continue to resonate even in this modern age that's moved so far beyond Zeus and his Olympians. Because we're still living in the aftermath of that first great change, still negotiating the relationship between deep structural forces and individual agency, still wondering whether the universe is fundamentally ordered or fundamentally open. The Titans represent the possibility of order, of knowability, of living in a world that makes sense, even if that sense is too vast for human minds to fully grasp. And something in us, something deep and old and maybe a little tired of constant uncertainty, still wants that, still reaches for it, still dreams of a time when everything fit together, when the pattern was clear, when you could trust the foundations because they were literally fundamental. We can't go back. The Olympian victory was real. The new order is established. Time is linear. The future is open. Individuals matter. But we remember, in our myths and our dreams and our deep structural longings, we remember that it wasn't always this way, that there was another kind of world once, built on different principles, governed by different powers, and that world is still there, underneath, always underneath, waiting with the patience of things that were before waiting was invented. The war lasted 10 years, or so the stories say, but measuring the titanomachy in years is like measuring the ocean in cupfuls. The number is accurate but meaningless because it tries to contain something vast in units that were designed for smaller purposes. 10 years of fighting. 10 years when the basic structure of reality was contested, when two completely different visions of how existence should work struggled for dominance, when the outcome would determine not just who ruled, but what ruling meant, what gods were, what the world itself could be. Zeus gathered his allies carefully, his siblings first, the ones Kronos had swallowed and Zeus had freed. Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, Hestia, each one grateful for liberation, each one committed to preventing their father from recapturing them. They weren't just fighting for power, they were fighting for the right to exist as themselves, as distinct individuals rather than undifferentiated aspects of their Father's timeless interior. Then came others, younger gods and goddesses who had been born into the world after the first cosmic divisions, but before the war. Métis, wisdom, who counseled strategy. Styx, the river that would become the binding oath, who sided with Zeus and brought her children Nike, victory, Baia, force, Kratos, strength, and Zelos, zeal, to fight for the new order. And crucially, terribly, Zeus freed the prisoners Kronos had imprisoned beneath the earth. The Cyclopes, those master craftsmen with their single wheel-like eyes, who could see straight into the essence of things and forge weapons from pure elemental force. They made Zeus's thunderbolts not physical objects, but concentrated change itself, bottled revolution, the power to transform what cannot be transformed. They made Poseidon's trident, which could split the earth and call forth springs and earthquakes, reaching down to the deep foundations where stone was still half liquid and responsive to will. They made Hades' helmet of darkness, which granted invisibility not by bending light, but by removing the wearer from the pattern of visibility entirely, making them unperceivable, because there was no longer a they to perceive. And the Hecaton Kyres, the 100-handed ones, monsters of overwhelming multiplicity, each one capable of hurling 100 boulders simultaneously, of fighting in 100 directions at once. Briareus, Cottus, Gyges. Names that mean nothing separately but together suggest the principle of excessive force, of power so abundant it becomes monstrous. Kronos had imprisoned them because they were too much, too chaotic, too difficult to incorporate into his ordered system. Zeus freed them because he understood that defeating order required chaos, that you can't beat a perfect system by being more systematic, but only by introducing elements the system can't process. Against this coalition, the Titans marshaled their own forces. Not all the Titans joined the war. Oceanus remained neutral, flowing as he always had, surrounding the world regardless of who claimed to rule it. Prometheus saw the future and sided with Zeus, knowing the outcome, choosing to align with inevitability. Themis also abstained, understanding that law itself transcends any particular regime. But the others fought with the weight of being first, with the authority of original creation, with the power of fundamental forces that had structured existence before existence knew it was structured. Hyperion brought light that could burn vision out of eyes, that could illuminate things so thoroughly they caught fire from being seen too clearly. Koios brought perfect intellect, thoughts so lucid they could cut through confusion and chaos and impose order on randomness. Krios brought conquest, the will to dominate, the insistence that might makes right, and the strong should rule. And Atlas, son of Iapetus, brought pure endurance, the capacity to hold up weight that would crush anyone else, to bear burdens that should be unbearable. He would need that capacity later, when the war was lost, and his punishment was to hold up the sky for eternity, to keep heaven and earth separated through sheer physical strength applied forever. The war shook everything, every part of the world, every layer of existence, every assumed truth about how things worked. The earth itself split and reformed as the combatants fought across continents. Mountains rose where the Titans made their stands. Valleys sank where Zeus threw thunderbolts that struck so hard they depressed the surface of the world. The ocean boiled where divine fire met divine water. Islands appeared and vanished as different forces contested control of specific spaces. The sky burned, not metaphorically, burned. The upper air caught fire from the friction of gods moving through it at impossible speeds, from the heat of Hyperion's concentrated light meeting Zeus's lightning. For periods during the war, you couldn't look up without your eyes drying in their sockets from the radiance. Time became unreliable. Kronos was fighting, which meant time itself was engaged in combat, and when time fights, chronology breaks down. Moments stretched and compressed. Past and future bled into the present. Soldiers would age decades in minutes, or remain frozen in a single instant for years. Causation reversed. Effects preceded causes. The dead rose and the living died, and both states became uncertain, negotiable, up for grabs. This was reality at war with itself. Not people fighting over who would rule reality, but reality's basic principles fighting over what reality should be. And humans, the first fully conscious humans who were emerging during this period, watched and tried to make sense of what they were seeing, tried to develop language adequate to describe it, tried to find safe places to hide while the foundations of the world were being renegotiated through violence. Most of what they saw, they couldn't explain. How do you describe gods fighting when the concept of God is still being determined by the outcome of the fighting? How do you name forces that exist before naming, that are literally creating the categories through which later humans will understand the world? They did their best. They told stories. They preserved images. They passed down fragmentary accounts that would eventually become the myths we know. But the reality was larger, stranger, more fundamental than the stories could contain. The Titanomachy wasn't a war in any normal sense. It was a transition between ontological regimes, between two completely different ways that being could be. And slowly, despite the Titans' advantages, despite their priority and their elemental power, Zeus and his allies began to win. Not through superior force, though they had force. Not through better strategy, though Meti counseled well. They won because the world itself was ready for what they represented. The perfect stable order of the Titans was beautiful but sterile. It couldn't grow, couldn't complexify, couldn't produce genuine novelty. Everything that could exist was already implicit in the initial structure. The Titans could rearrange the pieces, but couldn't make new pieces, couldn't surprise themselves, couldn't become anything they hadn't always already been. Zeus represented mess, chaos, unpredictability, the possibility that tomorrow might bring something that didn't exist yesterday, couldn't have been predicted from yesterday's conditions, genuine creation rather than just revelation of what was always there. And reality chose creation, chose possibility, chose the future over the eternal present. One by one, the Titans fell. Hyperion's light was captured and divided, given to Helios the sun god to carry across the sky in measured doses, no longer that terrible all-illuminating presence that made hiding impossible. Koios' intellect was shattered into fragments, distributed among different gods and eventually among humans. No longer that perfect unified knowing, but a collection of partial perspectives that could never again see the whole with complete clarity. Krios' conquest was broken, his will to dominate defeated by being dominated, his strength proven inadequate to the task of holding the old order in place. And Kronos himself, time itself, was cornered by his own son, confronted with the ultimate horror of his deepest fear coming true exactly as he'd known it would, unable to prevent the pattern from fulfilling itself despite perfect knowledge of what was coming. Zeus forced him backward through time, made him experience sequence in reverse, made him feel moments slipping away into past rather than flowing into future. And in that reversal, in that violation of time's directionality, Kronos was defeated, not by being destroyed, but by being made to experience what he had always inflicted on others: the loss of present to past, the inability to hold on to now, the terror of change. The defeated Titans were cast into Tartarus, as far below the earth as the earth is below the sky. A prison made from the absence of change, from eternal stasis, from the kind of frozen perfection they had tried to impose on the world, but now experienced as punishment. Walls of bronze surrounded them, 3 layers thick, unbreakable. Gates of iron sealed them in, locked with locks that had no keys, because they weren't meant to ever be opened. And above the prison, the Hecaton carers stood guard, their 100 hands ready to crush any attempt at escape, their 100 eyes watching every angle, every possibility. There the Titans remained, not suffering exactly, because suffering requires change, requires time passing, such that each moment of pain is distinct from the last. They existed in a kind of eternal suspended state, conscious but unable to act, aware but unable to affect anything, holding all their power and knowledge and primordial force, but unable to express it. The worst punishment possible for beings whose nature was to be active principles, shaping and structuring reality. They were made passive, inert, irrelevant. And above them, Zeus and the Olympians built their new world. The new order established itself quickly once the war ended, like water rushing to fill an empty vessel. Zeus claimed the sky, his natural domain, the realm of weather and thunder and the sovereign perspective that comes from looking down on everything below. Poseidon took the sea, wild and unpredictable as his own nature, subject to storms and hidden currents and sudden violence. Hades accepted the underworld, the realm of the dead who now truly died in a way they hadn't before, passing beyond the boundary of life into something irreversible. The earth itself was left unclaimed by any single god, shared territory, contested ground where different divine forces could meet and influence and struggle for dominance. This was new. Under the Titans, Gaia had been one thing, unified and complete. Under the Olympians, Earth became multiple, divided into regions and sanctuaries and zones of influence. And humans, the new humans, emerged into this fractured world. They were different from what had come before, more individual, more separate from each other and from the landscape. They had to name things now, had to create language complex enough to navigate a world where meanings weren't inherent, but had to be negotiated, agreed upon, remembered. They had to work. The earth no longer gave freely. Fields had to be plowed, seeds planted, harvests gathered. This was partly punishment for Prometheus's gift of fire, for human presumption in accepting divine power. But it was also just the nature of the new world. Things didn't happen automatically anymore. Effort was required. Choice was required. You could fail. This was the gift and the curse of the Olympian age. Freedom meant responsibility. Possibility meant uncertainty. The future was open, which meant it could go wrong. But it also meant stories were possible, Real stories, not just the eternal repetition of archetypal patterns, but unique narratives that belong to individuals, that could surprise, that could end differently than they began. Humans became the heroes of these stories, not because they were powerful, but because they could choose, could strive, could attempt the impossible, and sometimes, occasionally, succeed through cleverness or courage or sheer determination. Odysseus could outwit the Cyclops. Perseus could slay Medusa. Theseus could navigate the labyrinth. These weren't Titan-scale achievements. The Titans wouldn't have needed to trick or fight or navigate. They would have simply restructured reality, so the problem didn't exist. But that's exactly why human stories became compelling in a way Titan stories never could be. Humans struggled, and struggle implies uncertainty, and uncertainty implies that victory means something. The poets flourished in this new world. Homer and Hesiod spinning tales of gods and heroes, trying to make sense of the transition, trying to preserve memory of what came before while celebrating what came after. But they knew, or some of them knew, that something had been lost, that the bright, beautiful Olympian world, with its drama and passion and individuality, was built on foundations that were older, darker, more essential. That beneath Zeus and his siblings, beneath the temples and sacrifices and prayers, the Titans still existed, bound, silent, forgotten by most, but not gone, never gone, because you can't truly destroy foundations. You can build on them, cover them, forget about them, but they remain, supporting everything above, making everything else possible through their patient, eternal presence. And so, the world settled into a new rhythm. Days and nights regular, seasons cycling through their appointed rounds, time moving forward in measured sequence, space divided into clear categories, life and death, distinct states with a boundary between them. It was a good world, the world Zeus made. Better for humans, certainly. More interesting. More full of possibility. More capable of generating the kinds of experiences that make consciousness worthwhile. But sometimes, late at night, when the Olympian gods were sleeping and their influence waned, the old world would show through. The deep, slow, ancient world that was still there, underneath, waiting with the patience of mountains. You could feel it in certain places, remote places, high places, deep places, wherever humans had built less, wherever the Olympian overlay was thin, wherever the original structure of reality remained close to the surface. Standing on a mountain peak at dawn, watching the sun rise, not as Helios driving his chariot, but as light itself emerging from darkness, you could feel Hyperion, not as a person or a god, but as a principle, as the basic fact of illumination that makes seeing possible. Swimming in the deep ocean, far from shore, feeling the weight of water above and below and all around, you could feel Oceanus. Not the god who had remained neutral, but the primordial force of circulation, of water moving in eternal patterns, of the boundary between known and unknown. Falling asleep, feeling consciousness slip away into the formless darkness where dreams and memories blur together, you could feel Mnemosyne and her sisters, the old powers that governed awareness before awareness became something that belonged to individuals. These weren't visions or supernatural experiences. They were just moments of direct perception, seeing the world without the usual filters, feeling the foundations that supported the surface reality. And they were fine. These moments, they didn't threaten the Olympian order, didn't require any response or intervention. They were just there, available, waiting for anyone quiet enough and patient enough to perceive them. The world was deep, layered, complex in ways that stories couldn't fully capture because stories needed simple structures, clear categories, beginnings and middles and ends. Reality itself was more fluid than that, more tangled, more interested in being than in making sense. And that was exactly right, exactly how it should be. The tension between order and chaos, between pattern and possibility, between the Titan foundations and the Olympian structure, that tension was creative, productive. It made things happen that couldn't happen in either a perfectly ordered world or a perfectly chaotic one. We live in that tension still, every day, every moment, trying to make sense while surrounded by things that resist sense, trying to find pattern while experiencing randomness, trying to trust foundations we can't see, can't prove, can't fully understand. And maybe that's the final wisdom the Titans offer us. Not that the old order should be restored, not that Zeus made a mistake, not that we should try to go back to some imagined golden age when everything was simple and certain, but that foundations matter, that depth matters, that beneath all our stories and structures and attempts to make the world manageable, there's something older and larger and more fundamental that we depend on absolutely, even though we barely acknowledge it. The Titans are still there, still holding everything up, still providing the basic conditions that make complexity possible. We don't worship them anymore, don't pray to them or build temples or offer sacrifices. We don't even remember their names most of the time, but they don't need our attention, don't require our acknowledgement. They're too fundamental for that, too essential, too woven into the fabric of what exists. They just are. Just continue. Just hold. And that's enough. More than enough. Everything we need. The world is old. The world is deep. The world rests on foundations we will never fully understand, but can trust completely. And in that trust, in that surrender to the ancient patterns, in that acceptance that we're held by something stronger and older and more patient than ourselves, there is peace. Not the peace of understanding everything, but the peace of knowing you don't have to, because the foundations are solid, regardless of whether you comprehend them. The Titans taught us that, still teach us that. Every day, every moment we exist on this earth that is older than thought, under this sky that is deeper than vision, moving through this time that contains all time. We are the children of both ages, Titan and Olympian, foundation and structure, pattern and possibility. And that's exactly right, exactly how it should be. The old order isn't lost. It was never lost. It's just sleeping, dreaming, holding everything with the patient strength of things that know they will outlast every name we give them. Still there, always there, forever there, underneath, supporting, waiting, the Titans, the first ones, the foundations. And now, at the end of this telling, as your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts begin to drift, rest in that knowledge. Rest knowing that beneath all the chaos and confusion and uncertainty of the surface world, there are foundations, ancient, solid, reliable in a way that has nothing to do with kindness or care, but everything to do with simply being there, being real, being the ground on which everything stands. The Titans hold the world. They always have. They always will. And you, small and temporary and beautifully mortal, you too are held by them, supported by the same forces that support mountains and oceans and the wheeling of stars. You can let go. You can stop holding yourself up. You can trust the ancient strength that has held everything since before holding was a concept. The old order is still there, still working, still dreaming the world into being with every slow, eternal breath. And you are part of that dream, safe in it, held by it, cradled by forces older than fear, older than worry, older than anything except existence itself. Sleep now. The Titans are watching, not with eyes, not with awareness, but with the deep, impersonal attention of mountains, of time, of the foundations that never rest because they are rest itself. You are safe. You are held. You are home. In the deep dark beneath the stories, where the old order still rules, where nothing ever changes because nothing ever needs to, where time moves differently and the world is what it has always been. There, in that place, in that eternal now, in that foundation beneath all foundations, the Titans wait and hold and continue their slow, eternal work of being the ground on which everything else stands. Sleep in that knowledge. Rest in that certainty. Trust in that ancient strength. The world is old. You are young. The old will outlast the young. And that is exactly how it should be. The Titans hold everything, including you, especially you. Rest now. Sleep. Let the ancient world catch you as you fall. You are held. You are safe. You are home. The lost order of the world was never lost. It was always there, always here, always holding you. Sleep now. The Titans watch. The foundations hold. All is well.